You can give us the UC California. Oh, we're on.
Yeah, we
right?
might get that opinion.
Sorry,
Right?
sorry, we're talking amongst
DTLT today.
yourselves.
Welcome.
Yeah. And look at this. It really is DTLT today. The entire group with us.
Proof that we are all different people.
Yeah. Exactly.
That it wasn't just Jim wearing a Martha costume on Friday.
Yeah.
I don't think you can
know
still
about
rule
proof.
that out
I
based
guess
on
it's
this.
true.
Yeah.
I could still have been that guy.
Jim's been known to manifest himself in multiple instances.
This is true.
in
He has a
single
lot of
video.
Yeah,
personas.
and this is a green screen behind this. We could do a lot of magic with that alone.
That's what
lot
Andy
of- lot
keeps
of-
saying.
Don't believe anything you see right now.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
All right, we have a show today, and
We
we're going
do.
to let our anchor woman, Martha, frame it for us.
Oh,
This is her idea
didn't
for the
know that.
show. It's a good idea, but it's also kind of a sad topic.
It is.
And it's really kind of a litmus test just how screwed the university is.
Thanks for framing my frame.
But we're going to let Martin frame it. Besides all of that.
I should totally go off on a completely different topic after that.
Surprise.
Why don't you talk about what you can do with Google Docs?
How about Days of Our Lives?
I don't watch Days of Our Lives.
Whatever it is you watch.
Whatever.
Whatever.
No, so what we wanted to talk about today is a whole series of incidents in higher ed that have been happening, some very, very publicly, some not so publicly, that we've been following through ed tech circles that I think represent sort of this abdication of responsibility on the part of educators in terms of staying true and holding dear the soul and mission of the institution. And instead letting
I have
kind
a
of corporate
problem.
voices and administrators sort of...
I have a problem with that because how is pepper spraying a group of rowdy students at Davis have anything to do with the mission of higher education? I mean, obviously those
Right.
those police officers were threatened directly, and
Well, I mean, I think... Oh, you're being facetious.
just
I was like,
saying.
is he playing devil's
But it's
advocate?
almost like we've
yeah.
come so far
Yeah,
that even the fact that we're still having a civil conversation about this is insane.
is
to me.
right. You look at those videos and you wonder, why aren't people marching in the street? Like, that just seems so extreme. And the other thing that kind of hit me this weekend, though, that I have to say is that in reflection upon the entire Occupy movement, is that I feel like for the last 15 years, probably since I graduated from college, I've been sort of like witnessing what I think are pretty mind-blowingly awful things happening in our government and in our kind of our culture and our society in America, from, the stealing of an election
Yeah.
to an illegal war,
Yeah.
things that I would have thought, would result in people marching in the street, people sort of like rising up and raising up. And it hasn't happened. And for like a long time, I've thought, what is it going to take for this country to kind of is revolution just dead? Like, is the concept of revolution and the concept of rising up just dead in America?
I've thought.
But then it's like the notion that what has driven it to where it is now with Occupy ultimately is money.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like when they hit you in the pocket,
That's right.
suddenly,
Right.
and not that I'm criticizing necessarily the movement or that's what's taken us to this point, but it is sort of interesting that these other kinds of atrocities that we've witnessed, maybe everybody doesn't think they're atrocities, but I think a large portion of our...
Well, I wonder if it
of our
also
public
speaks to
does.
the new generation. I mean, look, we have a group of students right now
It's
that are in a
generational.
university that are willing to say, screw you. I mean, there was something like this when I was at UCLA in 1993 and 94. There was a La Raza protest. We occupied one of the buildings. It was kind of one of the rare protests in the 90s that you'd have at a
Right.
university. But, I mean, for the most part, when we were in university in the late 80s and 90s, that was not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Here
No.
you have a group of students now who are really hearkening back to the 60s
Yeah.
at Berkeley and at Columbia. And I want to give them credit, whatever. I mean, I could say all I
Yeah.
want, but like you were saying earlier,
Yeah.
look at these students go
Yeah.
and look at them stand in the
Absolutely.
face of these cops
Absolutely.
and saying, shame on you, screw you, what's your name? This
Yeah.
is unconstitutional. This is unconscionable.
Yeah.
And like, wow, I feel kind of like a goat. You know, these
Yeah.
I think
goody for them.
I think you're right in the generational thing. I guess as close as they get to the kind of the generation that came before this in terms of the protests. And I think one of the things that did happen at that time was there were so many protests and the war specifically, the Vietnam War. And I think what happened at that time was there was somewhat of a realization of the idea that soldiers came back. They were asked to do something. In many cases, they were drafted and put in these awful situations. And soldiers came back, and they were treated poorly for whatever reason, for legitimate issues. There were problems against that they had with soldiers, but they were treated so poorly. And I think there was a bit of a backlash after that.
Yeah.
So I think there was a complacency that happened after
Right.
the Vietnam War, and,
Yeah.
and protests really died down, and people didn't have the inclination to protest.
But I also
think
feel
we're
like
back
it's
to
like
a new generation.
I also feel
now,
like
though.
it's like, well, okay, it really sucks, that we've got elections that are being stolen, and we've got people, we've got wars that we're waging that we shouldn't be waging. But as long as the economy's strong and we're all more or less successful and happy, and we can,
The
buy what
market,
we
my-
want,
my
and the
house is
market,
worth
yeah,
what
and
it
my
was.
and the value of my house keeps going up and up and up. It's like that almost like lulls us into this sense of complacency
Well, I think
about
there
these issues.
I think there weren't the
Absolutely.
protests for the Iraq War, for instance, in that same vein, because of that feeling that they still. I think people realize that they still
the
needed
difficult
to
line of
support
supporting the
I mean,
troops
the people
versus
who were
right.
asked to
But
But that
everywhere.
doesn't explain
It-
why
and it doesn't
other issues that have
Exactly.
But New York City, there was, in many
Yeah.
major cities around the world, there were major protests that first time they went into Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
But, the rhetoric on the TV and the media of Bush and, terrorism, are you an American, are you not an American, this whole
Right.
kind of, and what we saw, and what's most interesting to me, and this is kind of what I got from the articles you passed on to me, is this whole idea of the militarization
Yeah.
of the university
God.
setting.
Yeah,
like the university, the militarization of what we're doing here. It's not only like,
the corporatization. It's
oh
the,
my
yeah.
God, it's like
and the
two-
juxtaposition in that one Huffington Post article that we were looking at of the police at Davis on Friday, juxtaposed with a picture of a security police officer at Columbia University arresting what was actually a drug dealer, a coke dealer. I don't know what the year was.
campus.
And that guy's like, the guy at Columbia is like dressed in a hoodie with like a lanyard around it. I mean, that's like his weapon. And the guys
No
at
pepper spray,
Davis
no
are
guns.
in riot gear for students who are sitting in a quad, in a public quad.
and if you watch that video, and I recommend you do, we just watched it here before. Any kind of assumption that these officers were under threat is absurd.
Yeah.
My
They
favorite
were
part.
calmly pepper spraying those students.
They were stepping
as
over
if
them.
They
Yeah.
were washing
Exactly.
the sidewalk.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
favorite part of that,
Yeah.
and the comments that came after this, is that the students had enclosed the police,
Yeah.
and they couldn't get
out. Yeah.
And so the demonstration of the guy just casually stepping over the students to get to the other side
It was
and then to
insane.
start spraying them is
Just
is
so that he
just-
could spray him in
ju-
the face instead of the back.
Exactly. So it's
Right.
ridiculous for them to
Yeah.
say that they couldn't get out, and it really does come down to as far as their behavior. And this is there was a good point in that blog that you pointed out, the deck chairs blog. I can't,
Music for deck chairs.
Music for deck chairs,
Yeah.
where there are probably some scared either trainees or scared police officers that are behind that guy not knowing what to do. So to paint all of them with the broad brush of all of them are evil is maybe a bridge too far.
It's what they're doing to the students.
Sure,
All of them are riotous,
absolutely.
all of them.
Well,
Come
but
on.
the leadership is doing that. But anyway, that's a fine point, and I don't, that's not anything that we need to debate too much. But
And I actually think like the fact that so now the head of police at UC Davis has been put on administrative leave, and to me actually what they're maybe trying to do is create fall guys out of the
Sure.
police on campus, and
Sure.
not that I approve of or think that what happened on the part of the police in that scenario was appropriate in any way, but I am willing to believe that they were taking orders from someone else, and that they were, feeling like they had a responsibility as part of their job because of the orders that they had been given. And I want to know how far up those orders go.
Right. Well,
and ultimately, that's where the blame lies.
Every indication of this, every kind of expert that's talked about, police training and that sort of thing, just say that it was terribly inappropriate,
Yeah.
and they were
But-
poorly trained.
I think one of the
and-
articles I read said that in prisons in California,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if prisoners are sitting down and a guard were to use pepper spray on them, that guard would be dismissed.
Yeah,
Dismissed.
exactly.
That it's against
You wanna-
any of their training.
You want to
Exactly.
believe that someone, that a police officer could have the courage to say, I'm not going to do that. Like,
This is the wrong thing to do.
Well,
yeah,
that's-
that
Yeah.
this is not right. You said use force, and yet they're not using force against us. So it makes no sense for me to casually, as you said,
Right.
pull out pepper spray
Well-
as if it were mouthwash and just
Which is
spray
why-
them
Really,
Yeah.
what
down.
they were doing.
Which
There's-
is why, the chancellor's argument that she had no other options.
Right.
Yeah.
Sending in the police should be an
Right.
option of last resort.
There's so many condescending
Yeah.
quotes that have come out from the police
Yeah.
side of things. One of them being, well, we didn't want to hurt the students because their arms were locked together, and if you try to lift them and you try to separate them, you could hurt their bodies. And it's like, there was obvious disdain for the
Yeah.
officer that was in front of these students,
Yeah.
spraying them in the faces.
Yeah.
Many of them, getting sick on the spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
brings to an interesting, enlightenment about this period of time and the fact that, in this day and age, it's like, when you had the Kent protests and when you had the Vietnam thing, it's like you didn't have this immediate, instant video of
Right.
video proof.
Yeah.
We talked about what the
Yeah.
Amazing.
what the chancellor came out and said, and what basically the university signed off on was this idea that the police were surrounded, they couldn't get
Yeah.
out, and blah blah blah. Their spin didn't work. It
Right.
could never have worked
Right.
in this day and age
Yeah.
and in this time because of YouTube, because of mobile technology,
Right.
because of the
Twitter,
prevalence
because of
of all of these technologies. The spin can't work anymore, and
Yeah.
it's an interesting development that just wouldn't have happened 10 years prior.
Well, I'm
The prevalence
amazed.
of surveillance.
right.
I'm amazed that with the obvious number of cameras, both video and still cameras at this instance,
They would still do it.
that they,
they would
as
have even
blatantly
Like
did
with that
what
many
they
cameras,
did.
that many
Absolutely.
flashes
did.
going
And
off.
you almost wonder what you said about,
Yeah.
maybe there was somebody who just, guy's about to retire or something,
Yeah.
and he's fed up with these protesters, and
He
he's
doesn't
going to go
care.
out in a
Yeah.
blaze of glory and doesn't care.
So, the Davis situation and the Berkeley situation has certainly been kind of dramatic stories in the front of all of our eyes for the last couple of days, but they come on the heels of the UPenn situation.
Penn State.
Penn State situation. And in addition, these other sort of smaller stories that I think we've been following within ed tech, including the removal of student wikis from Georgia Tech. And then the story, Tim, that you forwarded me today about what school is it that's going to be restricting
In
Missouri capture of video in the classroom
Wow.
because of the fear. And so I actually would argue that these are all related, that this is actually a symptom of a larger cultural issue within higher education that has to do with abdication of responsibility and a willingness to let kind of corporate voices and administrative voices that are in many ways beholden to corporate interests
Yeah.
dictate and regulate the ways in which we perform our duties as we fulfill the mission of our institutions.
Did you mention the wikis?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Georgia
Okay.
State. For
Yeah, the Georgia Tech.
Just at this, the
wikis.
idea that there is no conversation to be
Right,
had.
exactly. That
with these
there's
students.
and the notion too. If you guys have been following the post that Mark Isdale put up about that I left a comment, so I've been getting emails whenever there's another post, and now the tide is sort of turning on that post, and there are people chiming in and saying, well, there probably is a reason why we need to protect students from having this information out there in the open. What if they run for public office, or what if they're applying for a job in the future and somebody was able to actually see what they did in a course? And of course, I'm reading this thinking, awesome. Wouldn't that be a great thing? And then the notion, too, of, well, we should never require students to go online if they're not comfortable with it, because we would never want to make them do something that they're uncomfortable with. And then, like, what a slippery slope is that? Like, the notion that our job is to make students comfortable, whereas in classes, in education for centuries, we have been making students uncomfortable for good reason.
Yeah, that was the exact line of reasoning that University of Missouri was using to say we're going to start limiting lecture capture because the students need to sign off on it. Every student in a classroom, including the professor, would all have to sign off on something before you could do lecture capture, simply because what if students hadn't signed off on it and they said something that they didn't want to be held accountable for?
Yeah.
And it was like that's for their protection, that we don't want them to be captured in some public thing saying something. It's like, what?
Well, and it makes you wonder, like, at what point are they going to start trying to prevent people from capturing video of police officers?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like this can be twisted in so many ways that are not genuinely, even genuinely beholden to what I think are bad, bad tendencies on the part of wanting to protect students. But it's like now suddenly what you're really trying to do is lock down and regulate communication and information within our institutions, maybe because you fooled yourself into thinking that's what everybody needs, and maybe because you're actually just evil.
Well, I've seen that it's funny you say this. I've seen that kind of like lockdown and control, and there's a lot of talk in the chat that's really good about these police officers acting like counterterrorists. This whole idea that we've trained a police force to deal with the war on drugs and counterterrorism, and that's coming to our students to deal with peaceful protests, which is insane. Right. But when I think about this idea of communications and the freedom that we have, say, on campus, I can only think of my experience teaching in high school, is that students went in through a metal detector. Everything they had that was of valuable to them, they took away. Their cell phone. We didn't even have smartphones yet then. It was like 2003, 2004. And, I really do have this dystopic vision that that's what we're trying to do at the universities. They control the nature of communication, control how people can record and surveil what we're doing. And, we know it's an impossibility. And if you even want to pretend that a university is kind of the space of freedom. But I think the real shocking thing to me with all the recent examples is just how much the university in that 30 years that we talk about the corporatization of the university is really coming home to roost. And what should now be a scene of real kind of cultural,
like at this cultural moment, this should be like where the Renaissance is happening, right?
I mean, there should be a place where we could have this voice, where we could have this discussion.
Where we should,
there's no administration to be found. There's no discussions to be found. If they're faculty, they're usually faculty getting beaten up, like at Berkeley. Yeah. And so what we have here is we have a complete, devolving of the situation. As we said earlier, and has there been any word from President Obama? President Obama, are you still alive?
Yeah,
do you have anything to say about anything that's going on around your country right now?
It's remarkable that there has been no comment.
Well, no comment in the sense of like a press conference.
Well, and particularly
he's
since
probably
the
said
breakup.
something to his wife that we haven't heard.
And no comment on
reporters have asked him about the situation, especially with Occupy Wall Street.
Right, but not
he's addressed it, but not addressed it in any meaningful way.
And not address these particular situations at universities,
right. Nor has anyone here. I
think it's important to separate out. I think all of the Occupy situations, and a lot of those stories that have been coming out are really dreadful, but I think it's important to separate out what's happening on universities and colleges in particular, because those are different kinds of spaces, and the people participating in that represent a different thing in some ways. If there's any place where a healthy dialogue should be able to happen, where we should be applauding this sort of
challenge to the infrastructure of our
it should be at our institutions of higher education, and what we're seeing is almost worse.
Almost
than what we're seeing in some of the
worse than the Occupy Wall Street I saw. It does seem worse.
Yeah. Well, and let's make it entirely personal here. Even on our very campus, we have the Occupy Mary Washington movement, and yet when they went to speak to faculty, the biggest argument was whether or not they were allowed to. I mean, there was a lot of talk around campus about, is this the appropriate avenue for them to speak? And just so much bureaucratic red tape of, are they a student organization? Are they a club? Who do they go through?
In fairness to that situation, the way I read it was that what they asked to do was speak at a faculty senate meeting where there are actually very specific rules about how student groups come. And the reason why some faculty pushed back on it was that once they break those rules, they have then opened up the door. It's like now somebody's in judgment
But
of,
that's
well,
all
these
policy.
this
I mean, it just
it's-
reads all policy.
Well,
and
but-
it's like you're not being at all considerate to the
No,
moment.
I don't agree with that. I think the faculty who were saying that would have been happy to engage with these students in other forums and in other ways. It's not that they were saying they didn't want to have anything to do with these students or they didn't want to hear from these students or they didn't want to have a conversation with these students. What they were saying was a faculty senate meeting has these very specific rules for a reason. And now, if they let this student group in, what happens next week when the young Republicans want to come talk to faculty senate? And now they have to sit in judgment and say, well, we agree with the Occupy Wall Street students, but we don't agree with the young Republicans. And then they're getting into a really messy place in terms of their relationships with those student groups.
Of course, you could argue that, you know, the whole point of the Occupy movement was your rules aren't working too well frequently, so we're trying to go about this a different way and having a new conversation about how you do things in general, because what you're doing is clearly
But then the
problematic.
place to ask to have that conversation is not at a faculty senate meeting.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other ways to have that conversation. So,
The idea of the pepper spray cop meme was brought up in the chat as well, and talking about whether this is what was the quote, a victory for remix culture or trivializing a serious thing. I tend to separate the two out. I think it's a victory for the remix culture in the sense of if we are thinking about that as an artistic expression of events that are going on present day, then it is a good thing. I think there's a certain amount of trivialization that happens anyway. So
well,
Yeah,
I actually
also.
felt like through the trivialization, it in some ways almost empowered the image even more.
yeah,
You know, it's like the ridiculousness.
this has become
of it,
commonplace.
right? The
You know.
ridiculous of it, and
The banality of
yeah.
this evil
Yeah,
that's going
right.
around in our culture right now that we're seeing
and that actually,
everywhere.
right? I mean, it's like, you know, the actual image is just as ridiculous.
Right.
Well,
as
what,
some
and
of
what
the
it, and
the
what it
remixes.
becomes is a symbol, and a symbol is a very powerful
Yeah.
thing in a way that, and it was because of the meme of it that it's gone viral in a way that maybe just saying, oh, there was this protest and they did some pepper spraying, and it's easier to write that off than it is to see these powerful images of just a man just blatantly just
Yes.
pointing
Yeah.
a can at someone and spraying them in the face. And so, whether it's trivialization or not, yeah, I don't
No,
know.
there's something else happening there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually this kind of this widening gap we have with the video and the images and what we hear. And I think one of the ways that's kind of happening in that meme culture is it's bringing around to your actual involvement in the play somehow. But in that play, that obviously undergirds a sick culture.
Yeah.
And that play and the sick culture, I think, need to be in tension. So the trivialization or the empowerment is
Yeah.
actually that triangulation around all those ideas are important because this is something we're not dealing with in media. We're not dealing.
Right.
Look, if you're a University of Davis, UC Davis student, or a UC Berkeley student, and the administration is about to give you a debriefing on what happened on Friday today, what is your relationship to that information? I mean, what is your relationship to that structure right now that we really, what is this about, is higher ed administration is basically screwing the pooch, right? They're basically killing all sense of our faith in these systems at schools like UC Berkeley, UC Davis, Penn State, you name it, right? And so we have this real crisis. And we have other ways of dealing with it now than through those predefined channels. During the 60s, you would have that when the university or the government gave out their news media requests. We have different channels of dealing with it. And the meme culture is one. And it's a particularly provocative one because it doesn't distinguish along ideas of authority or even along ideas of a particular place in the political spectrum.
And I have to go. You may continue, but I got to go pick
That's all right.
up a kid.
Bye, Martha.
Bye.
That's
Well-
like a first.
Yeah,
Walking away.
Exactly.
At least you walked away. happy.
Occupy DTLT. We're not moving. No, the meme thing, to me, it harkens back to that idea of you got to laugh to keep from crying. When things get so bad, it's like you almost have to make fun of it just to get through it. But in another way of looking at it, it's sort of sometimes people have to be told time and time again, yes, isn't this absurd? Stop for a second and realize this is absurd. That's funny because it's so freaking absurd.
Right.
And the more you see it, the more like it's pounded into your head, suddenly you realize, yeah, it actually is absurd.
Well, how about that? The meme culture, whatever you want to do with that. If you want to put an age on it or put a distinction on it, I mean, the students coming up right now through these universities are, so many people attribute to this meme culture, so many attribute to this social media culture, and you know, this is one offshoot of it. They're not afraid to record, capture, and reframe what they see happening around them instantly.
Well,
And for me, that's a powerful part of this whole equation right now.
I do love that there's this term viral. You know, when it comes to these videos or these memes, the fact that we use this term that really is, you substitute the word plague, but that's not, really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking about this thing that moves through the body of the world, the global,
Yeah.
personhood so quickly. And the trivialization stuff that comes afterwards. But they think the best thing about these memes and the viral videos is that they come through without comment and without context in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what we need to do is have those conversations about the context and where we go from here. That's the great thing about it. Sometimes people are lost and directionless when these videos come through and they don't know what to do with them. But I think in many ways it's teaching people, again, how to think about these events.
Well, there's been a lot of viral videos associated with this that haven't been memes, right? Like viral videos that actually are students on the street capturing, a police officer, methodically spraying a group of protesters with pepper spray as if it was his job. And the same thing going with the Berkeley stuff. I mean, those videos were viewed hundreds of thousands of times, and those aren't memes.
Right.
Those are reportage, those are documentary footage from the actual battlefield.
Yep.
And these battlefields are university campuses, Occupy Wall Street down in New York or anywhere else, they kind of Oakland, where they've cleaned it out over the last couple of weeks. And, it's we're living in a fascinating but also a sick moment, and particularly sick because it seems like the use of excessive force to silence any questions about our financial system or our state of our democracy or the state of public education or the state of funding in general is such a hard question to deal with that we would rather cut out everyone's tongue, right? Like we'd rather just basically silence the whole country.
I don't think it necessarily comes down to that extreme of it's the 1% coming down on the 99%. I think it more has to do with just the simple nature of the control.
To me, it feels like a headless beast with no direction and a ton of authority.
Right.
But it's sort of this idea that, again, we've got these rules and that we have this system and these lines and everything, and you're not following
Exactly.
those.
Okay,
and something's wrong.
But let's face it, I disagree that it's headless and that it's far more kind of innocuous than it really seems. And here's my example. Occupy Wall Street, Occupy movement across the country and across the world in its own ways. How did they deal with that? Bloomberg tried to get them out a couple of weeks ago, right, or a month ago, saying like it's unsanitary. The same thing about the unsanitary, because that's what those cops at UC Davis were there to do. They were there using the same unsanitary. We have 200 tents or whatever, 200 students. It's unsanitary. We got to get them up and clean them out. And they went in there knowing that they were going to use force if they had to get them out. And to me, that seems like a coordinated effort around whether it be, these occupied public spaces and use something like sanity or the idea of sanitation and it's uncleanly, whatever, to get them out. This is something that's been rehearsed by cities, by police forces, and now by universities. This is not headless. This is a very pointed attack on freedoms that we should have.
Yeah, but I guess my point is that it's an attack in the effect that at the end of the day, every single person involved can point to someone else and say, well, the cops were just doing their job. The chancellor was just following, the basic standard operating procedures. The mayor is just following the books that have been in the law since the 1800s. And everybody can point to something else to the point where you create this confusing mess of a maze.
But that's where the YouTube videos of me have been awesome. Is like they point to the actual students who are saying to these people who are perpetrating these pretty heinous crimes against these protesters and saying, shame on you.
Yeah.
They didn't say, more powerful than anything is to watch the chancellor for UC Davis walk out to her car, and there are hundreds, if not 1,000 students who say nothing. Mm-hmm. They absolutely just say nothing, and it is chilling to the bone. And for me, that speaks to, the moment we're in between these figures of authority, like the chancellor, and these students who are supposed to be there and supposed to have a voice for a reason. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is where they're supposed to be thinking through what their whole world and what this world's supposed to be, and they're being met with extreme violence in their own backyard. Yep. That's insane. This is the train is coming off the tracks.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah,
and I thought it was going to end with their kind of cleaning it up.
It's exposed because of this ubiquitous information. I mean, because of the ability for this stuff to come out. I mean, it's wild to watch, and it's a dark time, but it's also incredibly fascinating, like you said, at the same time, because it's just like this kind of stuff. You couldn't see it. You couldn't see beyond what you could watch on the evening news before, and now you're seeing everything from multiple angles, and there is no spin on it anymore. What you're seeing, you're getting exactly what's happening.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really polarizing.
Yeah,
and it's starting to further polarize a country that's, I think, has been polarized. And you talk about this is headless. I don't think this is headless. And this is the last thing I'll say is, we've seen this gap in poverty, this gap in who has wealth and who doesn't. And more, the middle class and the lower class are just holding on for everything they have because the middle class is getting smaller and smaller. Lower class, poverty class is getting bigger and bigger. And that 1%, or however you want to say it, mm-hmm. has all the wealth. And Martha acts surprised at the beginning, like, I can't believe that it would take money. But in many ways, it doesn't surprise me at all mm-hmm. that it's going to take money and it's going to take to have the mass of your population simply trying to get by. Right. When you see this heinous kind of uses of authority and privilege to make sure those folks don't get by. I mean, that's what we're seeing right here. I mean, what's at stake with UC Davis? 2014, 2015, $12,000 tuition, which was $5,000 6 years ago, jumps to $12,000, and in 2014-15, they're saying that's going to be $22,000 for a public education at UC at the UC system. That is insane, and it's worth fighting over, and it's worth going to battle over because it's a class war that's being waged on the poor and the middle class. Yep. There's no two ways about it. That's what this is. Yeah. And, we could talk about all the details and how technology changed it, but you know what? In the end, it's the same thing that always happens. The rich are screwing the poor.
Well, and the other thing we need to pay attention to is what's happening in the UK, because what's playing out here is the same thing that's happening over there in terms of higher education and the cost rising and the students revolting in the same fashion. So we've seen it before, and we're going to see it again, and it just seems like it's going to resonate throughout our culture.
Yeah, and around the world.
Yeah.
I mean, Occupy Wall Street, one of the things that was really amazing that one Saturday when it resounded is that this is not, I mean, this started in other places. It didn't start in New York, right? It started in Iran. It started in Cairo. It started in all these different Middle Eastern countries, in Spain and Barcelona when they went to it, in Madrid. I mean, this has been going on in London when they've been rioting about the situation there. I mean, this is going on around the world. This is just another instance of it. I mean, the Berkeley students have been rioting and protesting for over a year now.
Yeah.
This has been going on for well over a year.
Right.
I mean, this is not new. And it's just reaching new heights. And I'm telling you, places like Italy and Spain, where they have another kind of frame, which is basically like their whole economy is going under, there's a real sense that things are not only changing, but there's going to start to see some really civil disorder around ideas of governments, around idea of wealth, and, all this stuff we started to say, that can only happen in Africa and these, puppet dynasties down in South America or whatever that we've created as a country. Well, you know what? That could be here. Yeah. We could have our puppet dynasties of wealthy people bringing out their forces to do exactly what they're doing at UC Davis. What is that? Take to the streets, people! Take to the streets!
Well, and to leave things maybe on a positive note, I think that is something that I think can be born out of this, is that in numbers you have power, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in terms of how the numbers play against the authority. And when it comes down to it, whether it's headless or not, it does come down to people feeling like their authority is being taken from them, and they are trying to regain it. I'm not apologizing for them, but that's probably the feeling that leads to dismantling the tent cities and that sort of thing.
There's power in numbers and there's power in information, and I
Right.
feel like these movements have both behind them.
Right.
So that's going to make it a very powerful thing, I think. So
Yeah. No rainbows and unicorns on this one. I don't. I think it's only going to get worse.
yeah. All right. Thanks for watching, folks.
Thanks.
Bye.